Welcome in to the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, with my co-host here, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And we are back breaking down our 10th team now, I think it is, of our 32 team breakdown from a fantasy perspective. We're very excited to keep going with the AFC South and the Indianapolis Colts.
Dude, so the Colts, man, this is one of the many teams that I'm very, very excited for next year. I mean, we saw last year that Shane Steichen offense, like Anthony Richardson, just teasing us with what could have been a
Yes.
potentially great season. And they finished 9-8. They just missed the playoffs. Minshew stepped in and played pretty well. But yeah, it's just kind of those, what could have been. And looking at their offseason, they brought in Joe Flacco as a backup quarterback. Obviously with a guy like Richardson, like, you have to prepare for the worst, but hopefully he's not going to see the field. And in terms of free agency, they really focused on, retaining their in-house talent. So they didn't go out and sign a lot of big names, but they secured Michael Pittman, a few other guys, which I thought was, very important. And then, the thing with not bringing in a lot of new guys is, you really have to, knock out of the park your first couple draft picks. And in my opinion, they really did that. And so they were on the board at, like, I want to say they were pick 15,
Yep.
and it was the first defender off the board. And they had their choice of, corner, edge rusher, whatever that might be. And Leatu Latu was their guy, edge rusher out of UCLA, stud player. A lot of teams kind of had medical concerns with him. If you're not familiar with Latu, he was actually playing at Washington before UCLA. He was medically retired, but listening to kind of his thoughts on that, he didn't really feel like the team and the doctors handled that in the proper way. Transferred over to UCLA and was just an absolute destroyer.
Yeah.
Kind of a karate master with his hands, like just a guy that can get to the quarterback, which is so important, especially in this division with guys like CJ Stroud. And then in the second round, like getting Adonai
Couldn't
Mitchell,
believe
wide
that.
receiver out of Texas, like he was mocked to them in a lot of mocks in the first round. Like this guy is just an athletic freak. I mean, he's got just the upside to be a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL by maybe his second or third year. A few things to clean up, maybe here and there, but the upside is through the roof. And the great thing about, Adonai going to this team is you already have a clear cut number one in Michael Pittman. You've already got an elite, running back in Jonathan Taylor. And you've got a guy in Josh Downs who's a second year slot receiver who I think, is going to take a step forward this year. So really the pressure is kind of off with him, at least at the beginning. Alec Pierce is kind of that field stretcher. And, you might see, and we'll get more into Mitchell in the fantasy component of this, but, you might see Mitchell kind of have a low snap count to start the year, but, he's one of those guys where the upside is through the roof. And if you look at, last year with Anthony Richardson, he was a little bit more of a project, and you just see how immediately he meshed with Steichen and that team. So I'm very excited about the future of this team.
Yeah, I agree for sure. This is going to be another exciting team from a fantasy perspective. They have so many good players. I mean, guys at all the skill positions, possibly in the top 10 at their position, with Richardson possibly top 5, JT top 5, Pittman, he's probably going to go a little bit later, 15 maybe, but has that potential to be in the top 10 as well. So, this is going to be a very heavily drafted team for their star players, which is very exciting. Um, Building off the AD Mitchell, let's just start with the receivers from the fantasy perspective here. And I think that the landing spot for AD Mitchell was perfect. I was very surprised that he just seemed to drop in the draft. Like he just kept falling and falling and falling. And even the day before the draft, Schefter was the one who came out and said that AD Mitchell he expected to go earlier than people thought, which was surprising to me. Um, that he'd come out and say that the day before and then have him slide all the way down to the middle of the second round. So I love the landing spot, good offense, good quarterback, good young quarterback, and has an established one in front of him. I was a little worried about when I was seeing Buffalo, because he has motor concerns, and if he's going to be the number one option with, kind of taking plays off, that's not really going to work. And that's not how you build trust necessarily with your quarterback. As the number two with a solid slot player, that's obviously still not a good thing. Probably a big reason why he fell. But I think he's got more of the potential to overcome that when there's not going to be so much pressure on him right away out of the gate. So I like AD Mitchell. I don't know that he's necessarily going to be a major fantasy player this year. I don't know that he's going to get drafted in a lot of redraft leagues. He's going outside the top 60 receivers. So he's more of a dart throw. He's actually getting picked after Josh Downs, which I think is probably right. Downs showed a lot of speed, can get deep. He also showed that he can, every once in a while pop off for some volume. So I think Downs is a good player. And Mitchell's an exciting prospect that, going into next year, that might be somebody that we're talking about as a mid-round wide receiver and somebody that could easily become a waiver wire priority early in the year. Going over to Pittman, that's a player that he should be awesome, right? He's going to be a rock solid wide receiver 2. And the other thing about Pittman is that he had all the upside in the world 2 years ago, and then he didn't meet that. And then last year it got knocked down a little bit. And then Richardson looked so good. And then Minshew gave him a ton of targets. So he kind of looked back like the number one player that, or the number one wide receiver that he kind of should be. And then going into this year with maybe the injury concerns around Richardson, he's gotten pushed down a little bit. Plus, there's just so many good wide receivers in the league right now that, it's kind of just like he could go 8th or he could go 15th, So I also think that the Flacco pickup as their backup that you mentioned, I think that should alleviate some concerns about Richardson's health. We saw how good Flacco was for Amari Cooper last year. So in terms of Pittman, if they do have to go to their backup, that isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world for his fantasy value. So I really like Pittman. I think I'm going to end up with a lot of Pittman personally if I end up drafting a running back or a quarterback in those first 3 picks in a super flex 3 wide receiver league, because I don't have any problem taking him in the 4th round. And if he's there, that's somebody that can be a very strong wide receiver option, especially if you've gone running back, quarterback, receiver. You're looking for kind of that wide receiver 2 in round 4, somebody to kind of strengthen that spot. I think that Pittman's going to be a very good option at that point in the draft in a super flex league.
Yeah, I think I agree with kind of everything you said, and just touching on each guy individually. Josh Downs, when he was on the field with Richardson, they seemed to have, a good rapport. And obviously that was very short-lived. And so when I'm looking at the draft, he's probably not someone I'm going to be targeting, but early on in the year, I could see him, if you're in a 3 wide receiver league, someone that's, going to get a fair share of targets that, has some speed, maybe it's someone you want to be looking at. But kind of touching on AD Mitchell and, what you said specifically from a fantasy perspective and him probably not being relevant this year, I tend to agree with that. And I will say, he's kind of one of those guys that we see every year, and kind of reflecting on how I've drafted over the years, where I kind of take a shot on, rookies late. If that's someone that you're targeting late because of the upside, make sure that your roster is locked and loaded and set outside of having to put him in, because it's, like I said, he's probably going to take a while to get onto the field. It might take a little bit to get acclimated and push Pierce out of that. But, he's one of those guys where at the end of the year, if the chips fall in the right direction, like he could be, a very dominant fantasy player. But, like you said, I don't really see that happening. And, if you want to take a shot on him in like a best ball league, that's fine. And then, yeah, Pittman just kind of seems like a very solid number 2. Like I have no issues drafting him. I think his ADP right now is 16. And, jumping over to, I guess, segueing to Anthony Richardson, he's someone that I've talked a lot about and really wanting to move him up very high. Like, I know in our last episode, you talked about CJ Stroud and wanting to move him up to, 2 or 3. That's kind of how I feel about Anthony Richardson. In a super flex league, if I'm looking at, the first 2 rounds, in my opinion, I feel a lot more comfortable with taking, Richardson at, 10 and then getting AJ Brown than maybe I do Jalen Hurts and Chris Olave. And so Richardson's one of those few guys where he could be the quarterback one, but he could be the quarterback one by a pretty wide margin if things go right. And I don't know, man. I want to move him up to two. I don't know, but I hope for health, and it's not one of these guys that I was a homer on coming into the draft a year ago. Like I watched him at Florida, and I watched him kind of take over the game against Utah and some other plays, but I also saw a lot of very sloppy play, and I was worried that that wouldn't transition into the NFL and good coaching and talent. So we'll see, man. I'm very excited to watch him.
Yeah, I really like Anthony Richardson too, just not as much as you. Like talking about pushing him up to two, I think kind of elevates him to his upside without baking in any of his downside.
Sure.
So for me, I wouldn't be looking to draft him that high necessarily. But like you said, if you think that's the upside and you expect health this year, that taking him in the second round of a superflex draft, a 10-team superflex draft, gives you all kinds of upside at that first quarterback spot. So I totally understand the enthusiasm. I'd probably take him at 6, maybe 7 amongst quarterbacks, that second round range. My only reservation about taking him is quarterback is supposed to be, I say supposed to be, there's guys that get hurt every year, so it's not necessarily a guarantee, but your quarterback is supposed to be one of your safer spots from injury. And taking a quarterback one in a super flex league that has such high injury risk, you have to account for the replacement value of that player. In a one quarterback league, there's no issue with taking Richardson high, pushing him all the way up because you can get a guy like Herbert behind him, right? Or you can get a guy, like Dak, maybe reach a little bit on your second quarterback just to make sure you have somebody that's good. But in Superflex, chances are if you take your third quarterback, especially in a deep rostered league like this, you're going to be looking down at maybe Deshaun Watson being your third, or Baker Mayfield, or Derek Carr. Shout out to Derek Carr again. But like if you're taking a third quarterback and you feel compelled to kind of maybe reach on a third quarterback or make sure you have a good third quarterback, it can be an interesting strategy or an interesting worry during the draft that I prefer to try and avoid at quarterback. If I'm going to be drafting a quarterback that early, I want somebody that I feel confident is going to play. And I guess that's kind of why I've always shied away from Lamar in superflex leagues. I just am always worried that he's going to get hurt. And it's a similar kind of concern with Richardson because it's not like they're getting all of their points from passing. They're getting so much of it from rushing, and they're going to run. And so, until he shows that he can be a little bit more elusive, and like you said, he could be quarterback one. He's got the rushing upside. He could rush for 15 touchdowns, and just blow away all expectations. Now, I think Josh Allen has kind of established that he's got a very, very high floor and high upside. He's just always up there at the top of the quarterback ranks. So I don't know if he could be far and away ahead of Josh Allen, but he could be up with Josh Allen in that top tier. So there is a lot of upside, a lot to be excited about, but I'm just presenting the opposite viewpoint for our listeners about Anthony Richardson specifically, because if you are going to take him, you just have to know that your season basically is going to hinge on his health in Superflex. And if he gets hurt, you're going to be in trouble in a way that you otherwise wouldn't be if you go a different position there and then pick a quarterback that's maybe a little bit safer health-wise. So that's the strategy around Richardson. Again, I still really like Richardson. I still am hoping to get a lot of Anthony Richardson this year. I think the upside is off the charts, but I don't play in exclusively Superflex leagues, so maybe Anthony Richardson's my quarterback target in some of my one quarterback leagues.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, like if he's a guy that you're targeting early, like make sure you get, I don't know, at least like a Will Levis as a quarterback 3. And so just kind of protect yourself in that regard. But at the end of the day, like we've said before, it's the upside, wins championships. Like we're not playing to get 5th place, and so we'll see. And I guess moving over to the running back position, I'll let you kind of take the Jonathan Taylor thing because I'm super excited about him. Obviously, coming into last year, he had health concerns. He had the contract issue. We didn't really, I think we saw him on the field with AR for like two snaps
Hardly at
or
all. Yeah.
something ridiculous. So, what do you think about him? How are you attacking him? Um,
Yeah. So last year, right, we saw Zach Moss be very productive in his role, right? And it took him, he was out for the first 4 weeks, and it took him a good 4 to 6 weeks to really pick up and get going. And then he kind of ran with the job the rest of the year. And he was very good again last year. 2 years ago, he was so bad. It was so disheartening. And I kind of shied away from him everywhere after he was hurt and stuff. And I know I think he went in the 8th round of our league. And I was just like, I don't even want him. But coming into this year with Anthony Richardson at quarterback and kind of the offense very much looking different than it did even 2 years ago, I expect him to be very good, right? I expect him to be a top 5 running back. I expect him to be scoring a lot. With that said, I do think having to share touchdowns with Richardson is going to be an interesting dynamic. We saw it with Zach Moss a little bit early in the year when Richardson was on the field. He left a couple games early, but then I think he still had 4 or 5 rushing touchdowns in his 5 games or 6 games. So, there's that element to this for sure. We see it in Philly with the Jalen Hurts scoring so many rushing touchdowns and limiting the running backs that are on the goal line. So I think there could be a little bit of that going on here this year with Taylor. The other thing, my other issue with Taylor just in general is I've gotten so used to playing in 3 wide receiver leagues that where you have to pick Taylor, I'm just looking to go receiver. So like that's like an interesting issue for me with JT is like I think I would rather have like AJ Brown, or I'd rather have Garrett Wilson, or I'd rather have maybe even like Puka or Taylor. That's kind of where I'm looking at having him overall. And where I put him there, I just don't end up with him very often because a lot of people think I'm way too low on him there and would push him all the way up above AJ Brown. So, there's a little bit of a dance to be had with where to pick these guys this early. And I'm usually just leaning receiver early in the draft. So for me, I don't end up with a lot of Jonathan Taylor, but if he were to fall, into the middle to end of the second round, possibly early third round in a super flex, in a 10-team super flex league, again, remember that. So, into that 22, 23 overall range. That's where I think I would be looking to attack Jonathan Taylor if he did fall to that point in the draft. But before that, I'm just not sure I'm going to be in on him.
so let's say that you start Justin Jefferson and you've got the 6th pick or whatever that might be, and it's coming back to you. The quarterbacks of the top tier are gone in a super flex format, and you're looking at Jonathan Taylor versus like an Ayuk or a Olave. Are you still attacking
Well,
receiver based on 3 wide receiver format, or are you
no,
taking Taylor?
no, but I mean, you picked wide receiver 11 and 12 overall. Like those guys are going in the middle of the third round or later. So
So then
like,
what's your cutoff? I guess I would say.
well, I think Puka, right? That's like at that wide receiver 8 range. I think that's where I'd have running back 4 and where I'd be looking for Jonathan Taylor at that point. Um, so after Garrett Wilson and either before or after Puka, I think. And that's the other thing about Superflex is I also really like the top tier quarterbacks. So all the way down to Anthony Richardson, I would be comfortable taking any of those quarterbacks before I take Jonathan Taylor. I think the running back position is really deep. I think that you can get a very good running back 1 in round 3 or even in round 4 this year in a super 10-team superflex. Again, down to like 35 overall in superflex. You can get Derrick Henry there possibly, or you can get Rashad White there in the 4th, maybe even the 5th round. There's just a lot of really good running backs that I think make it to round 4, make it to round 5. And when you're looking at having to fill 3 wide receivers and both quarterback spots, going running back early is just something that makes me feel like I'm always behind the ball at wide receiver because I feel like I can get a reasonable starter at running back, and I'd rather fill out the positions that have less risk for injury before I go in hard on running backs that have a higher risk of injury. That's just how I've ended up structuring my teams, and that's why I say, end of the second round, anywhere between 18, 23. I mean, I think that's all fine to be taking him there. Um, but I mean, even Devontae Adams, he's right in that 10, 9, 10 wide receiver area. That would also kind of be a difficult decision for me. So I think Jonathan Taylor's kind of in that tier with the 8, 9, 10 wide receiver.
In this type of strategy discussion is the reason that we play three wide receiver superflex, because if you're just in a traditional two wide receiver format with one QB, you look at the draft and it's very cookie cutter. But
Yeah.
when you add in these extra roster spots, it makes your strategic decisions all that much more important, because things can really thin out very quickly. So if you're not in, that type of league, we highly encourage you to join one, because it makes it so much fun.
Yeah, I agree for sure. And people are probably listening, or if you're listening to this and you do play in a league like that, you're probably thinking I'm crazy, right? That Jonathan Taylor is an easy first round pick, which in a 10-team standard league, he would be. And there's not really a lot more to it. Nobody's picking Devontae Adams over Jonathan Taylor in a two running back, two wide receiver, point PPR league with no quarterback considerations. But when you have to go a little deeper at wide receiver, you still have that extra flex. You're looking at starting 4 receivers a week. The ones that you pick up top become all that much more important. And the more you can rely on those top end wide receivers, the better your team is going to be overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And we discussed, with the Cleveland Browns, targeting zero RB, different guys late in the draft. So, that's something that, we'll see quite a bit with three wide receiver leagues. But yeah, I agree with your point there. I'm not sure if you want to touch on tight end with these guys, if it really matters at all.
I don't think they have anybody that
Yeah.
matters. I mean, I think Mo Ali Cox is still there. Will catch a couple touchdowns throughout the year. Might show up on a waiver wire list or two throughout the year, but there's nobody here that's going to get picked at tight end. So that's our full wrap on the tight end part of the Colts team. And just as a summary here, they're very concentrated in Richardson, Jonathan Taylor, and Michael Pittman. And that makes those players all the more valuable. You know that those players are getting volume. And in fantasy, right, volume is king. So you want to get in on this offense. I think they're going to be very efficient. And I think getting one of those 3 players is going to help your team in a major way this year. So the Colts are very exciting. I'm hopeful that they have a better year this year. I know they finished over 500. Minshew kind of kept them afloat, but I hope to see them in the playoffs this year. I hope to see them go maybe 11-6, something like that. And yeah, hopefully end up with Pittman somewhere, and hopefully he's going nuts all year long.
I agree, man. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. And with that, that is all for the Colts. And we'll talk to you guys tomorrow to go over the Jags.